Introduced myself before. My name is Jordan Lauber. I work for the BC Green Party, and I have a master's in economics, not a PhD like these guys. So that's why I'm getting a little bit dirty and mixing politics into it and everything and policy. And because we're all here, because we're members or involved in the Green Party, and we're interested in what we can do politically and in terms of policy formation to make a better economy, I want to go into some of these policy implications of what Andrew and Fernanda were just talking about. So the question for us is, given everything that we heard today, everything that we've learned and that we know about the world and the economy, what is the role of the government and policy in shifting us towards an ecological economic paradigm? And so to start to answer that question, we need to acknowledge, first of all, markets, which, as Andrew mentioned, markets are a very useful tool. Like they're incredible in the way they're able to coordinate a whole bunch of activity by a whole bunch of different actors to come up with some kind of good outcome. And it's not obviously always the best of all worlds, because as we've seen, we're doing a lot of things to the planet, but just look at this room and everything that's in it, and these computers, and all of this was somehow accomplished by markets, facilitating exchanges of knowledge and materials, and it's pretty incredible. And economists are really big fans of markets, but sometimes tend to gloss over some of the what are called market failures. Usually it's maybe one small chapter in your microeconomics textbook if you're studying economics, but it's actually something that's really significant that we need to look at some more. We already talked about externalities, the fact that transactions between two parties can have consequences for another party that's not part of that transaction, like the carbon dioxide emissions that are created and that then affect the entire climate for everybody. There's things like monopolies that sometimes governments need to get in and break up, and oligopolies. We have missing markets, so there might be things for which there actually is no real market, and governments need to try to provide those services that are nonetheless needed even though there's no market for them. Intertemporal discounting. This is an important one because another way of thinking of this is intergenerational equity. The question is how much should we be leaving for the next generation, or the generation after that, or the generation after that? Well, in economics, I learned that the proper answer is however much we decide we want to leave them. Ultimately that's a political question that markets aren't going to address. Markets are looking mostly at our short-term needs and wants, and not what we want to leave for generations ahead of us. That's a political question. And then there are things like public goods. Who's going to provide the services that we all use? Like, if you were walking around the city at night, you saw street lights out, you're not paying for that service directly. Maybe you're indirectly paying for it, especially if you live in Nanaimo. But basically governments need to step in and provide some of these things that we need collectively and that are very difficult to, you can't set up a toll for who's going to use the light from a street light, for example. And so in order to make these goals and set these policy priorities and address some of these imperfections of the market, we need to have our priorities straight. We need to know what's more important than other aspects of the economy. So this diagram here shows us kind of the current paradigm. We've got growth down here at the bottom, the base of the pyramid, because that's sort of the foundation of what politicians like to aim for. They think we've got to find ways to grow the economy. And so that's why you see politicians wearing hard hats during election campaigns, and often, you know, it's a question of whoever wears the hard hat the most often is the winner. You know, Christy Clark arguably won the last election because of the number of hard hats that she wore. Actually, like, we should get a political scientist to study this, but we need to get some green hard. Actually, Andrew has a green hard hat that he got at the 2013 AGM, so we'll be bringing that up. And of course, okay, so there's all this talk about economic growth and development, and what is that all for? Well, this is kind of straight from the Liberals in the last election too. You know, they talk about jobs and families. So what they basically mean is, you know, economic growth is going to create lots of jobs, it's going to create well-paying jobs, and that means that people are going to be able to provide for their families. And that's, you know, that's the chicken in every pot idea and the car in every garage that, you know, gets politicians elected quite often. People, you know, feel anxiety about whether or not they're going to have a job, especially these days, you know, in this post-2008 world. And if somebody's telling them, look, we're going to create a new industry that's really going to rev things up and create all these high-paying jobs, it's very attractive for people. So that's kind of the big policy priority. And then the et cetera at the top there, what that encompasses is things like, you know, if we have higher economic growth, you know, and more jobs, you know, we'll have more taxation, and then we can pay for things like education and healthcare and all that. I mean, the government likes to talk about, well, you know, we'll have more money for education and teachers, you know, after the LNG industry is really humming, you know. They hold that up there. So in terms of kind of the ultimate end that we're looking for, it's sort of the provision of services and job security and prosperity for individuals and families. So shifting over to ecological economics, everything that we were just talking about, what actually makes sense in terms of how governments prioritize their policy decisions? What should they be based on? Well, here's a new pyramid for you. The first one, ecological economists would argue, is sustainable scale. We need to know what our limits are in terms of how big can the economy get? How big is the biosphere? What can the biosphere support in terms of economic activity? That's our hard limit. We can't go beyond that. So we need to make sure that we are, whatever we do, sustainable scale. Then comes just distribution. So once we determine what our scale is going to be, the question is, well, who's going to get what? If we're going to be making choices about what kinds of economic activity we have, how do we distribute the products of that economy? And then after that, then we start talking about efficient allocation. And so the difference between allocation and distribution in economics is distribution is really about who gets what, ultimately, and economic allocation is about how are, you know, the factors of production being applied to, you know, in the most efficient way to producing the things that we need and meeting our wants. So that comes after those things. So why this order? I'm sorry, that might be a little bit difficult to read. Sorry. So I'll just go over it. So obviously scale, and I already mentioned this. Scale is important because we only have one planet, so that's what sets our scale. What the implication of setting our scale, optimal scale and sustainable scale is that some of the things that we've previously been thinking of as being free from the environment, we're now going to have to attach value to it and start recognizing the scarcity. So one of those things we've been thinking of as free, for example, is the capacity of the Earth to absorb the carbon dioxide that we emit. Because, you know, it's actually, the Earth has a huge capacity to absorb this. The oceans have been taking the brunt of it. But now we're starting to see, oh, the oceans aren't able to absorb as much anymore because they've already absorbed so much that they're becoming acidic. and now more and more of the carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere, and it's warming the planet. So, so we need to realize that the ability to absorb those wastes is now finite, and it has a value, it's scarce, and it needs to get into the economic equation. The main criterion for sustainability, or for scale, is sustainability. Sustainability being defined as meeting human needs without compromising ecosystem health. And obviously allowing us to do that from one generation to another. So scale is the first priority when setting policy for ecological economists. Then comes distribution, because obviously once we start recognizing, you know, the inherent scarcity of this ecosystem and the surfaces that we live with that sustain our life, then the question comes, okay, well, who owns the airshed, or who owns the capacity, you know, of the atmosphere and the oceans to absorb these wastes? Who owns the watershed, you know? Is it, you know, Nestle can pay $2.50 for 1 million liters or something, or 2 million liters? You know, is that, like, really? Like, do we own the water? Do they own the water? Does the government own the water and they get to just lease it out to whoever? We need to really, we have some questions we need to answer about this. Like, who does this ultimately belong to? And obviously not all of these assets are things that can be traded in markets. I mean, one example would be the value of a marshland in providing us with free water purification services. That's not something that is really easy to market. You know, we can't chop up that marsh and start trading marsh derivatives. So there's certain things that we're going to have to manage more collectively. And ecological economists argue that the main criterion for distribution is justice. And now justice, you might be wondering what justice is. Justice is something that we arrive at politically and through our, you know, ethics, through, it's basically our paradigm, the pre-analytic worldview that we bring, like what do we consider to be fair and just? And that's a question that every society and every time period is going to need to answer for itself. But it is important nonetheless. And after we determine the scale that we're aiming for, and how we want to distribute things, then we start looking at efficient allocation, which that's what markets are really good at. Markets are good at you know, theoretically, if you want to build a house, you know, you can go to the market and you can look at the prices of all the different types of materials that are available for building your house, and based on your budget, you choose the right materials that fit your budget and that meet the quality and the other specifications you're looking for, and you build that house. But the reason that efficient allocation can only really be calculated after we determine the scale and the distribution questions is that prices themselves are created by those factors. Like, scale determines scarcity. So for example, right now, the price of gas is really, really cheap, but that's only because we haven't valued you know, the capacity of the earth and ocean and airshed to absorb our CO2 wastes. Once we start valuing that and start pricing that into, working that into the price of gas is going to be more expensive, and then the decision of, you know, what's the best energy input into this particular, you know, project or this vehicle is going to change. So we don't even have the ability to make those decisions until we set this idea of scale and start valuing what hasn't been valued yet. So we're going to shortly go into a little exercise where we're going to start thinking about some of these questions. We've got a few questions and we're going to break up into groups to discuss. But before we go there, I'm going to bring up some policy principles that Herman Daly, the father of ecological economics, has proposed, and which I think would be very good for us to bear in mind as basically policymakers. So one policy principle is first of all that every policy goal requires an independent policy instrument. And so an example I give of this is the notion of taxing bads. So I think many of us might be familiar with the idea that, hey, you know, why are we taxing income? Why don't we shift taxation to things like pollution instead? Things that we want to discourage, not that we want to encourage. And that's, you know, like to a certain extent, you know, that's going in the right direction. But what is sometimes missed with that is that taxation isn't just about what we want to encourage or discourage. It's also about how we raise revenues collectively to address, you know, to provide collective services or address collective problems. So what we're doing if we sort of shift all taxation to bads is that we're mixing policy instruments. We're mixing an instrument for raising revenues with an instrument for discouraging pollution. And what if we're really good at discouraging pollution and suddenly we have no tax base? And then we're just, you know, we're wobbling all over the place. So we need to really think about these things sometimes separately and go like, you know, what is the single instrument that we can use most effectively to achieve that goal of reducing pollution? Yes.
Can I give an example of that? Is the regional district in Nanaimo is suffering a real financial problem because we're doing so well at recycling and exporting our garbage is the other thing. We're doing so well in that department that it's not generating enough revenue at the landfill, so therefore we do not have the money to pay for more recycling programs.
Wow, okay, perfect example right there. So sometimes policies can have unintended negative consequences.
I object. There are more complicated issues around that, but anyway.
Okay. Whoa.
We won't go into local government issues right now.
Okay. So a second principle of policy is that it should strive to achieve the necessary degree of macro control without the minimum sacrifice of micro-level freedom and variability. So what that means is you want to, say carbon emissions, again, sorry to keep bringing up carbon emissions, but it's a perfect example. This is something that is it's a global problem. When you emit carbon dioxide, it affects the entire climate of the Earth. And so as a country, like Canada, for example, we know that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by a certain amount to do our fair share, and other countries need to do their fair share of reducing carbon emissions as well. But we don't want to go in as a government and say to that specific factory, you must reduce it by exactly that amount, or you must reduce it by exactly that amount. It's better to come up with a policy instrument that says, okay, this is what we're going to aim for, and then we're going to apply a carbon tax or a cap and trade system that's going to allow the market to figure out what are the cheapest and most efficient ways that we can achieve this goal. So without being too micromanagerial, basically setting the envelope and then shrinking the envelope down to achieve that goal. Third principle is that policy should leave a margin of error when dealing with the biophysical environment. So the fact is, and we've seen this so many times, we don't really understand the world. We think that we do, but you know, so time and time again, even with all the science that we have, we'll do something that has unintended and catastrophic ecological consequences that we could never have envisioned. It's sort of, I like to use the analogy of, you know, there was an old woman who swallowed a fly and then she swallowed a spider to catch the fly and swallowed something else to eat the spider. Like, that's what we've been doing to our ecosystems, because we keep generating more and more problems every time we try to fix something. We have you know, a bunch of, you know, an infestation of something, we bring in a predator to them, and then that causes another imbalance. So we need to leave a margin of error and realize that we are actually still at an infantile level of knowledge of our ecosystems when making policies about how we're going to deal with our with anything that affects the ecosystem. And then fourth, we have to always recognize that we start from certain historically given initial conditions. So as much as we want to just, you know, new world starts now, you know, we're redistributing everything, we're, you know, we're going to throw everything out. The fact is that we're starting from where we are right now. We have certain types of capital, we have a certain distribution of wealth, and most of these things are not optimal, but we're starting from there, and we need to, any policy that we adopt needs to recognize that and help us transition from there to where we want to go. Otherwise, I mean, that's when you get into civil war and you know, economic collapse. You know, it's kind of like, actually, a good example of that would be when Mao dictated, you know, shortly after, or during the revolution, we need to increase our steel production. And so he told everybody, you know, build a small kiln and, you know, start producing steel, you know, all the farmers. So they're like, okay, you know, like, let's do it. So they were all producing steel and not tending to their crops. And then they had this massive famine. And they had millions of people die because they didn't recognize, like, there's a transition process that we need to go through. We can't just start shifting from an agricultural society to an industrial steelmaking society right away. Fifth, policies must be able to adapt to changed conditions. You don't want to be like too narrowly prescriptive about like exactly what you're going to use, because I mean, even 20 years ago, I mean, you wouldn't have expected to see this laptop here sitting on this table. You wouldn't know what it is. And you know, now everybody has a computer in their pocket, at least one computer in their pocket, and and we need to be able to adapt to the changes in technology, the changes in the climate that are happening more rapidly than we anticipated. They need to be flexible. And then the last principle of good policy making is that problems should be addressed on the same scale, by institutions of the same scale as the problem. So that's where municipal waste actually comes in as a good example, because, you know, municipalities know, you know, they're better positioned to deal with the local problem of logistics, like how are we going to collect our waste. It's not so much something you'd want the federal government to get involved in, even though there are some macro level things we can do in terms of waste as well. But for the most part, it's a problem that's local, so a local decision-making body should be in charge of it.
This is your last principle?
Yeah, that was the sixth.
So can I ask maybe your opinion?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you missed a principle there, which I think is very important.
Sure, yeah.
And that is that, like, I don't want to say there's a lot of negativity towards salesmanship and things like that.
Yeah.
But how you phrase policies will decide whether they work or don't work and get you elected or not getting elected.
Yes.
And you didn't list that at all.
Yes.
And I think if you write policies that scare people instead of writing policies that inspire people, then you have a problem.
Yeah, you're
Like,
right.
I think that is definitely a principle of writing policy.
So Herman Daly, he actually wrote this more as, he wasn't thinking about politicians and, you know, tips for how they would write their policies and communicate them. He was more thinking of, you know, this is how we should make inherently good policy. And then actually one of the discussion questions that we're going to come up to right away, so we can make sure you're in that group, is how you would communicate the shift that's needed in terms of the economic paradigm to your friends and neighbors and family in a way that they will, you know, understand and also not be freaked out by.
Yeah, so I would expand on that and say that's great. Sounds like an economist. I'd like to talk about the real world, which is also something that you hear a lot about economists.
Yeah.
And so I would say it is a fundamental principle of good policy that it needs to include people and embrace people and be communicative. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's not a good policy, because that is true in the real world, just period.
Exactly, and I guess partly that would be encompassed by the, we have our historical initial conditions, which is that's basically, you know, we have, part of our initial conditions is that we have people seeing things in a certain way. They have certain aspirations. I mean, just take here in North America, for example, you know, it's an aspiration of probably most people to own their home. It's like a part of our economic paradigm that, like, you know, you should move towards home ownership and all that kind of stuff. Lots of other countries, like in Europe, I lived in Europe for a number of years, like most people rent. Like they don't think there's anything important about owning your own home. They want to have a home, but they don't mind renting it. Some people rent a place for 20 or 30 years, you know. So we do need to start with those kind of, you know, cultural things that we're, you know, that we all have. Oh, and I mixed up slides here. I just wanted to quickly go over another 3 rules of sustainability that Herman Daly proposed. So obviously we want all of our policies to be sustainable, so that's how this fits in. And so for example, so the first rule of sustainability is that renewable resources, and that includes things like, you know, fish and groundwater, etc., should be used no faster than the rate at which they can be replenished. So that's basic sustainability. You know, if you fish faster than fish can reproduce, it's not sustainable, and you're going to have the collapse of the fishery. We've seen that already. So that's a no-brainer. Secondly, how do we deal with non-renewable resources? So something like oil, for example. Well, he proposes that they should only be used at the rate of, non-renewable resources should only be used at the rate at which we can identify substitutes, adequate substitutes for those non-renewable resources. So in the case of our fuel, for example, we need to be looking at renewable sources of energy that we can transition into from oil. And basically we should use oil only insofar as it is fueling the transition to something that is more renewable. So that's basically what this principle is saying. And then the third principle is that obviously pollutions and, you know, waste products should be emitted no faster than natural systems are able to absorb and recycle them, which again goes back to, you know, the example of carbon dioxide. If we're producing more carbon dioxide than the trees are able to, you know, absorb and store and recycle, then we've got a problem. We're filling up our pollution sink faster than the drain. So with all of those principles in mind, I want to go into some group discussion. And